Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're taking a completely thrilling dive into what is arguably one of the most famous courtroom dramas in human history, the trial of Socrates. Picture it. The year is 399 BC, and there's this old, barefoot philosopher standing before a jury of his peers, literally fighting not just for his life, but for the very survival of his ideas. But here's the catch. We aren't just looking at some dry, everyday court transcript. Instead, we're using Plato's idealized account, the Apology, to uncover the profound philosophy hidden right there within this fight for life. Okay, let's dive right into this.
Here is the docket for today's proceedings. First, we'll look at fact versus Platonic fiction. Second, the accusers and the indictment. Third, the divine mission. Fourth, his uncompromising defense. And finally, we'll cover the verdict and his final words.
So, kicking things off with fact versus Platonic fiction and understanding our source material. You see, history actually gives us a couple of different approaches to this trial. Writers like Xenophon, for example, gave us a very literal, factual chronicle of the events. But Plato? Well, Plato gives us what we might call an ideal truth. The Apology is absolutely not a verbatim, word-for-word court transcript. What Plato has done is taken the essence of Socrates, including some of his actual words for sure, but he's elevated them into this masterful artistic composition. He's essentially painting an idealized portrait of his master at his absolute greatest, standing completely defiant against the state.
Now, to really get Plato's portrait, we have to grasp this concept of Socratic irony. Socrates had this fascinating conversational habit of feigning ignorance. He'd constantly act simple, claiming he just didn't know the answers to things, which effectively let him troll his opponents right into a logical trap. But here, in a courtroom where his actual life is on the line, that usual intellectual sass acquires a sort of tragic pathos. He's playing his intellectual games with a jury that literally holds the power of life and death over him.
Moving on to the accusers and the indictment. Just who exactly wanted Socrates dead and why? Socrates actually separates his prosecution into two very distinct camps. First up, the nameless accusers. This is basically the ancient equivalent of the court of public opinion, or really a decades-long cancel culture campaign. Comic poets like Aristophanes had spent years writing plays characterizing Socrates as this crazy crackpot with his head up in the clouds, and Socrates actually fears this group way more because, well, how do you even cross-examine public prejudice? You can't. On the other side, though, we have the professed accusers, men like Miletus who brought the actual, formal, legal indictment. They formally charged him with not believing in the gods of the state and with corrupting the youth of Athens.
But before he even tackles those formal charges, Socrates has to clear up the massive public confusion fueled by those nameless accusers. He insists to the jury, "Listen, I am not a natural philosopher." He claims he knows absolutely nothing about the physical sciences, like whether the sun is a stone or the moon is earth. He has no idea. And crucially, he points out he is not a sophist. Sophists were these traveling teachers who took pretty hefty fees to teach young men rhetoric. He proudly points out that he's never taken a dime from anyone. Mostly, he says, because he has absolutely nothing to teach.
This brings us to the oracle's divine mission, which is really the origin of all this hatred.
So, Socrates explains that his rather enthusiastic friend Shariphon once went to the famous oracle of Delphi and asked a pretty wild question. Is there any man wiser than Socrates? And the oracle's answer? There's no man wiser. Now, when Socrates heard this, he was completely baffled. He genuinely believed he knew nothing at all. So to vindicate the oracle, or maybe just to test it, he set out on a mission to find someone, anyone, wiser than himself.
So how exactly did this turn into a recipe for making enemies? Well, Socrates created a very methodical three-part test. Step 1. He went to the politicians, the men known for their wisdom in running the state. He questioned them and found out they actually knew very little. Step 2. He went to the poets, whose words were widely celebrated, but found they couldn't even explain the meaning of their own poems. Step 3. He went to the craftsmen. Now, they certainly possessed specific technical skills, but because of that, they foolishly assumed they knew everything else about the world too. By acting as this constant questioning gadfly, Socrates ended up thoroughly and very publicly embarrassing the Athenian elite.
After questioning literally everyone, Socrates finally realized what the oracle actually meant. His only real advantage, his only true wisdom, was his radical self-awareness. He knew nothing, but unlike the politicians, poets, and craftsmen, he actually knew that he knew nothing. They falsely imagined they knew everything. Exposing this grand illusion is exactly what caused the bitter enmities that ultimately landed him in court. All right, let's look at his uncompromising defense and how he goes about dismantling the prosecution.
Socrates calls his primary accuser Meletus right up to the stand. And let me tell you, in the hands of a master debater, Meletus just doesn't stand a chance. Meletus had formally charged Socrates with introducing new gods, but in the heat of the moment, during the trial, he slips up and claims Socrates is a downright atheist who believes in no gods at all. Socrates immediately pounces and gets Meletus to admit that Socrates teaches about spirits or the sons of gods.
And right there, Socrates springs a brilliant logical trap. He asks the jury to consider this obvious contradiction. I mean, think about it. How can a downright atheist believe in demigods? If you believe in the sons of horses, well, you must believe in horses. If you believe in the sons of gods, you absolutely must believe in gods. He entirely foils Meletus, making a complete mockery of the indictment. It's brilliant logic for sure, but remember, humiliating the prosecution in front of everyone isn't exactly the best way to win over a jury's sympathy.
And honestly, that is exactly the point here. Socrates stubbornly refuses to compromise. He flat out tells the jury he will not desert his post. He views his philosophical questioning as a literal divine mission, stating he's going to obey God rather than man. He famously compares himself to a gadfly, biting the lazy, generous steed of Athens just to wake it up. And most defiantly of all, he absolutely refuses to bring his weeping children into the court to beg for pity, which, by the way, was a very common practice back then. He argues that trying to manipulate the jury's emotions makes a complete mockery of justice. He is only going to use the truth.
Finally, we reach the climax of the trial, the verdict and final words. The jury votes, and he is found guilty. But now, in the penalty phase, you've got to hear the sheer audacity of Socrates here. Asked what penalty he truly deserves for waking up the city and dedicating his entire life to their moral improvement, he actually suggests a reward. He says he should be given free meals for the rest of his life in the Prytaneum, an incredibly high honor usually reserved for Olympic victors and war heroes. He is essentially looking at the jury and saying, I haven't committed a crime. I've actually done you a massive favor.
Now, as you might guess, proposing free meals for yourself isn't exactly going to satisfy a jury that literally just convicted you. Eventually, urged by his friends, including Plato himself, who was actually sitting right there in the courtroom, Socrates proposes a monetary fine of 30 mina. It was a hefty sum, but his friends offered to guarantee it. But by then, the damage was completely done. His refusal to grovel and his absolute unwavering insistence on his own righteousness pushed the jury right over the edge. They vote for the death penalty.
Upon actually receiving his death sentence, the tone of Socrates' speech shifts entirely from that gentle irony to a really lofty, commanding prophecy. He issues a stark warning to the judges who condemned him. He tells them that executing him won't help them escape accountability for their lazy lives. In fact, silencing him is going to backfire spectacularly. His death will act as a seed, spawning many, many more disciples. And these younger critics, who won't be unburdened by his older, gentler restraint, are going to judge the city much, much harsher.
But as for himself, Socrates has absolutely no fear. Turning to those who voted to acquit him, he explains why. And this just brilliantly illustrates his absolute truthfulness. He doesn't pretend to know what death actually is, but he argues it can really only be one of two things. Either it's a long sleep, a dreamless, completely undisturbed rest, which, let's be honest, sounds incredibly peaceful. Or it's a journey to another world, a place where he can finally meet the great heroes of old and face truly just judges. In either scenario, he concludes there is absolutely nothing to fear.
We end our explainer with his ultimate Stoic conclusion. Socrates faces his executioners not with panic, but with complete, serene resignation to the divine will. He says, no evil can happen to a good man, either in life or after death. It's just an incredibly powerful assertion about the sheer resilience of virtue. He truly believed that if your soul is good, no physical harm, not even an unjust execution, can truly touch you. So, as we wrap up this exploration of Plato's Apology, I want to leave you with this provocative thought. In a world where we are constantly pressured to conform and compromise, what would you be willing to drink hemlock for? Thanks so much for learning with me today.